Chapter 1: The Hum of Decay. The air in Maintenance Corridor 7C always tasted of recycled breath and ozone, a metallic tang that coated Myra's tongue. She ran a hand along the cold, sweating metal of the bulkhead, her boots echoing in the otherwise silent passage. Above, lights flickered with an irritating irregularity, a symptom of the bunker's slow, inexorable decline. It was a decline Overseer Valerius preferred to ignore, or rather, to address with platitudes and resource rationing for the lower levels. The C-block residents, however, were not so easily placated by words when the water from their taps ran brown more often than clear. Myra reached Section Gamma 9, the triple-sealed access point to what was euphemistically termed the Quarantine Zone, or QZ. Decades ago, before her birth, before the all-clear signal that had proven so tragically false, QZ had been Level 12. A hub of research, they said. Now it was a concrete tomb, its secrets and sorrows locked away behind 3 layers of reinforced plasteel and stern warnings. A place spoken of in hushed tones, a boogeyman for unruly children. Her datapad glowed, displaying the pressure readings from the interstitial spaces between the seals. Seal 2 inner chamber showed a fractional dip. Again, third time this cycle. Small, almost negligible, but the trend was undeniable. Pressure variance Seal 2 Gamma 9. She spoke into her comm, her voice flat, logging it for the third cycle, requesting closer inspection. Static answered for a moment before a bored voice. Technician Jorel from Central Monitoring replied. Noted, Myra. Overseer Valerius has already reviewed the anomaly reports. Standard degradation. Patch it if you see a physical. Myra scowled. Standard degradation didn't account for the faint, almost subaudible hum that seemed to press against the innermost door, a vibration she could sometimes perceive through the soles of her boots if she stood still enough. It wasn't the thrum of machinery. The entire level was supposedly powered down. There's a vibration here, Jorel, unlisted in schematics. Probably your stomach rumbling, Myra. Go get some nutrient paste. Central out. The line clicked dead. She pressed her ear to the cool metal of the outermost door. The hum was there, a faint thrumming resonance that felt organic, like the breathing of some colossal beast. Her own stomach tightened. Nutrient paste sounded particularly unappetizing right now. She ran her diagnostic tool along the frame of Seal 1. No immediate structural compromise, but the metal around the primary locking mechanisms felt colder than the rest of the door, a subtle condensation clinging to it. A small sound made her straighten. A scuffling, then a child's soft giggle. Myra turned. Little Una, no older than 8, hair the color of dried straw, peered around a junction box further down the corridor, eyes wide and bright in the dim light. The girl had a habit of appearing in places she shouldn't, a tiny ghost in the bunker's underbelly. Her mother, a listless woman from Habitation Unit, barely seemed to notice her absences. Una, you shouldn't be here, Myra said, her voice softer than it had been with Jorel. This section is off-limits. Una skipped closer, unafraid. She often trailed Myra, fascinated by the tools and the forbidden zones. The shadows dance here, Una whispered, pointing a small finger towards the QZ door. They have too many elbows. Myra crouched. Shadows, Una. What kind of shadows? Children in the bunker had vivid imaginations, fed by confinement and recycled stories. The long ones, Una said, her gaze fixed on the door. They come from the cracks when the lights blink. They whisper. They told me. They told me they're hungry. Her face, usually so open, was clouded with a seriousness that was profoundly unsettling in a child. Whispering shadows are just stories, sweet, Myra said, forcing a reassuring smile. The lights playing tricks. But the girl's unwavering stare at the QZ door sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the corridor's ambient chill. The hum seemed to pulse in time with Una's unsettling pronouncement. No, Una insisted, her lower lip trembling slightly. They showed me, in the bad dreams, they showed me the door opening. Myra stood, taking Una's small, cool hand. Let's get you back to habitation, Una, and you tell me if these shadows bother you again, all right. She would mention this to medical. Children sometimes developed anxieties in the oppressive atmosphere of the deep levels. As she led Una away, Myra cast one last glance at the Gamma-9 access. The hum persisted, a silent promise of something waiting, standard degradation. Valerius could call it what he wanted. Something was wrong with the quarantine zone, and whatever it was stirring. The cold spot on the door, Una's disturbing clarity, the pressure drops, they were pieces of a puzzle she was beginning to dread solving. The bunker had kept its secrets for decades. It seemed some secrets refused to stay buried. She made a mental note to divert a micro camera through a ventilation crevice later that shift, off the official logs. Jorel and his complacency be damned. Later, in the cramped solitude of her own small habitation unit, sleep offered little respite. Una's words echoed. They have too many elbows. They told me they're hungry. The faint vibration from the distant QZ, a thing she dismissed or rationalized for months, now felt like a heartbeat under the floor, a rhythmic throb that resonated deep in her bones. She thought of the schematics she'd pulled from the restricted archives, schematics that showed Level 12 not just as research labs, but as a high-security biocontainment facility. The Contagion event, as the fragmented records called it, was described with chilling brevity. Rapid, uncontrolled biological proliferation, unidentifiable morphogenic properties, Level 12 compromised, containment protocols enacted, zone sealed, no survivors listed. Myra stared at the ceiling, the recycled air hissing from the vent. The all-clear signal that had come years after the sealing had been the bunker's great hope, the promise of an outside world recovering. But the expeditions sent to the surface had dwindled, their reports becoming sparse, then ceasing altogether. The bunker doors had been resealed, this time with a grim finality. Now, the mistake was not that the all-clear was false, but that they had ever believed it. They were trapped with their own history, and part of that history was stirring behind 3 layers of plasteel, humming its hunger into the dark. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Ducts. The micro-camera was a scavenged relic, barely functional, its optical sensor scratched. Myra painstakingly guided its fiber-optic tether through a narrow ventilation duct that, according to older, less sanitized schematics, branched perilously close to the QZ's outer shell before connecting to a defunct air scrubber system. Official channels were a dead end. Valerius's administration prized stability, or the illusion of it, above all else. Curiosity about the QZ was not only discouraged, it was treated as a sign of instability itself. Hours into her off-shift, fueled by stale ration bars and a growing sense of unease, Myra watched the grainy, flickering feed on her data pad. The duct was choked with dust and a strange, fibrous material that looked like desiccated cobwebs, but thicker, more resilient. The camera's weak light cast dancing shadows, playing tricks on her tired eyes. She almost gave up, convinced she was chasing phantoms conjured by stress and Una's unsettling pronouncements. Then a sound, not through the datapad's tinny speaker, but a faint scraping from the vent opening in her own hab unit, the one she'd used to deploy the camera. Her breath hitched. She muted the datapad's audio, listening intently. A skittering, multi-legged rhythm, impossibly fast, accompanied by a high-pitched chittering that set her teeth on edge. It was close, too close. She scrambled back from the vent, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound ceased. Silence pressed in, heavy and absolute. Seemed Striders, a half-forgotten name from a censored incident report, flashed in her mind. Creatures that could move through the smallest crevices. But they were supposed to be a myth, a horror story to keep engineers from cutting corners on SEAL integrity. Shaking, Myra turned back to the datapad. The camera feed was still active. She advanced it a few more centimeters, the tether groaning in protest. The image resolved into a view of a larger conduit, and there, adhering to the pitted metal wall, was a thing. It was pale, almost translucent, like stretched parchment over a framework of needle-thin bones. Long, impossibly slender legs, far too many of them, splayed out from a central, pulsating node. It was one of the seam Striders, exactly as the suppressed files had described. It wasn't a myth. It was real, and it was outside the QZ in the ventilation system. The implications were terrifying. The SEALs were not just failing, they were actively being breached. As she watched, paralyzed, another movement caught the camera's periphery. A shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom of the conduit. Larger, slower. It wasn't a Strider. This form was humanoid but distorted, its limbs elongated, its movements jerky and unnatural. It seemed to glide rather than walk, its head, if it was a head, obscured by the poor lighting. It paused near the seam Strider, which immediately ceased its chittering and became motionless, as if in deference. The larger figure extended a limb too long, too thin, and touched the Strider. A silent communion. Then the figure turned, its obscured face somehow seeming to fix on the micro-camera's lens. Myra snatched the datapad, her hand flying to the recall winch, yanking the fiber-optic cable back with frantic speed. She didn't stop until the camera clattered out of her vent, trailing dust and the strange, fibrous webbing. Sleep was impossible now. The bunker, once a refuge, felt like a porous cage. These things were not just in the QZ. They were probing, exploring, perhaps even hunting within the safe levels. And the hierarchy, the rigid control Valerius prided himself on, was utterly oblivious or willfully blind. The next cycle, Myra approached Guard Captain Kalen. Kalen was a hard man, his face a roadmap of scars and stress lines, but he was also pragmatic, less insulated by bureaucracy than Valerius. She found him in the echoing, seldom used gymnasium, methodically punching a heavy bag, each impact a sharp crack in the stillness. "Captain," she began, her voice carefully neutral, "I have reason to believe the integrity of the QZ perimeter is compromised beyond standard degradation." Kalen didn't stop his rhythm. Punch, crack, punch, crack. Overseer Valerius is aware of the pressure discrepancies, technician. He considers them within acceptable parameters. With respect, Captain, pressure discrepancies don't account for biological incursions. She held out her data pad, displaying the grainy image of the seam strider. "I saw this in Vent Conduit 9, adjacent to the QZ boundary." Kalen paused, his gloved fist hovering near the bag. He took the data pad, his expression unreadable as he studied the image. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the air recyclers. "This conduit, it's supposed to be sealed off from the QZ side. Older schematics show junctions. Redundant systems now derelict. One of them must be breached." He handed the data pad back. "One image of an unidentifiable organism isn't enough to challenge the overseer's assessment, technician. It could be anything. A mutated insect, a trick of the light." "And the larger figure," Myra pressed, frustration rising, "the one that seemed to direct it." Kalen's eyes narrowed. "You saw something else." "Yes, humanoid, but wrong. It was aware of my camera." She recounted the encounter, the chilling sense of intelligence. Kalen resumed his punching, but the rhythm was broken, his strikes less focused. "The QZ has been sealed for 53 years, Myra. The original Contagion was aggressive. Nothing was supposed to survive. Certainly not organize. Punch, crack. If what you're saying is true, if there are active, intelligent entities from the QZ loose in the vents, then we are facing a crisis Valerius is completely unprepared for." "So you'll take this to him?" Myra asked, a sliver of hope. Kalen stopped, turning fully to face her. His gaze was bleak. "Valerius listens to what reinforces his control. He will see this as a threat to stability, not as a warning. He'll silence you, Myra, and me if I push it." He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. "But I can authorize a maintenance sweep of Vent Conduit 9, discreetly. You and I off record, see what's really there." It was more than she'd expected, less than she hoped. "When?" "Next cycle, dark hours, bring your tools. And Myra," he added, his voice low, "bring something to defend yourself with. If you're right, data pads and diagnostic tools won't be enough." As Myra left the gymnasium, the weight of Kalen's grim acceptance settled upon her. The bunker's carefully constructed order was a thin veneer over a festering wound, and that wound was beginning to weep. She thought of Una again. They have too many elbows. Perhaps the child saw more clearly than any of them. In the deep, recycled darkness of the bunker, the whispers from the ducks were growing louder, and they spoke of a hunger that had waited patiently for a very long time. During her next work cycle, Myra noticed something else. One of the sanitation workers, a man named Purvis from Orville's crew, was acting strangely. His movements were jerky, his eyes unfocused, with a peculiar glassy sheen. He was meticulously cleaning a section of corridor wall far from any actual grime, his head cocked as if listening to something no one else could hear. When Myra greeted him, he didn't respond, simply continued his repetitive, senseless scrubbing, a faint smile on his lips. A chill traced its way down her spine. The puppeteer spores, another horror from the QZ's grim catalog, active not just within the sealed zone but potentially among them. Chapter 3: The Archivist's Secret. The rendezvous with Kalen was set for the darkest part of the bunker's simulated night cycle, when most inhabitants were confined to their hab units. Myra, armed with her standard toolkit and a heavy, metal alloy pipe she'd borrowed from a derelict storage locker, met the guard captain near a seldom-used service hatch leading into the labyrinthine ventilation network. Kalen carried a pulse pistol, its energy cell indicator glowing a reassuring green, and a high-intensity beam lamp. "Stay behind me," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble. "And no sudden moves. If we see anything we observe, then we withdraw. No heroics." The ventilation conduit was larger here than the one Myra had used for her camera, but still oppressively narrow. Dust lay thick, disturbed only by faint, unsettling tracks, not animal, not human. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something acrid and faintly sweet that made Myra's nostrils flare. The fibrous webbing she'd seen on her camera feed was more prevalent here, hanging in thick, ropey strands that brushed against their faces. Kalen's lamp cut a sharp swathe through the oppressive darkness. "Tracks," he muttered, pointing the beam at the floor. The imprints were multi-pointed like those of a giant insect, but with an unnerving asymmetry. Seam strider spore. They moved cautiously, the silence broken only by their breathing and the crunch of debris underfoot. Myra's senses were stretched taut, every shadow seeming to writhe with unseen movement. The sweet, acrid smell intensified as they neared the coordinates Myra had logged from her camera. Suddenly, Kalen stopped, holding up a hand. He directed the beam upwards. Clinging to the ceiling, almost invisible against the dark metal, was a seam strider. It was larger than the one Myra had seen on her feed, its limbs splayed, its multifaceted eyes gleaming like black jewels in the lamplight. It was perfectly still, watching them. "Don't move," Kalen breathed. Myra held her breath, the pipe in her hand feeling woefully inadequate. The strider remained motionless for a long moment. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it scuttled sideways and vanished into a smaller intersecting duct. "Damn things are fast," Kalen said, letting out a slow breath. "And too quiet." He swept the beam around. "No sign of your larger humanoid." "It was here," Myra insisted. "This is where I saw it." They pressed on, finding more strider tracks, more of the unnerving webbing, but no sign of the more significant entity. The conduit began to slope downwards, the air growing colder, damper. They reached a junction, a larger chamber where multiple ducts converged. And here they found something new. On the wall, smeared in a dark, viscous substance that thankfully wasn't blood, was a symbol. It was a complex geometric pattern, almost like a circuit diagram but with an organic, flowing quality. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence. "What in the zone is that?" Kalen whispered, playing the beam over it. Myra shook her head, a cold dread seeping into her. "I don't know, but it wasn't here on the schematics. It's new." She took a scan with her data pad, the device struggling to categorize the energy signature. As she worked, a faint sound reached them. A rhythmic, wet rasping. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the junction, from a duct that led directly towards the QZ's primary core, a section marked on the schematics as Biolab Omega Extreme Hazard. Kalen gestured for silence, then crept forward, pistol raised. Myra followed, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, a horrible, laborious breathing, punctuated by soft, wet clicks. They peered around a rusted support beam. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by Kalen's lamp, was a sight that would haunt Myra's nightmares for years. It wasn't the humanoid she had seen on camera. This was something else. A grotesque mass of flesh, vaguely torso-shaped, adhered to the wall. It was a sickening tableau of exposed, raw tissue, pulsating gently. From its core, a structure of what looked like fused, elongated vocal cords and lung tissue, glistening and raw, stretched taut. It was this that produced the horrifying, rasping breaths. The clicks came from somewhere within the mass, like bones snapping or cartilage tearing. This was the vocal cord. Myra felt bile rise in her throat. This thing was alive. It was part of the Contagion, a grotesque, living organ embedded in the bunker's infrastructure. The source of the hum she'd felt at Seal 2. "Zone, protect us," Kalen breathed, his face pale in the lamplight. He took a step back. "We need to report this. Now, Valerius has to see this." But as they began to retreat, a new sound joined the rasping breaths. A soft, almost melodic humming coming from multiple directions around them. Myra looked up. Figures were emerging from the shadowed openings of the other ducts. Pale, slender figures in tattered remnants of what might have once been uniforms. Their mouths were sealed by a smooth, unbroken membrane of glistening skin, yet the humming sound seemed to emanate from them, a chorus of silent, internal song. Their eyes, wide and vacant, were fixed upon Myra and Kalen, the silent choir. "Move," Kalen yelled, shoving Myra ahead of him. He fired a pulse bolt at the nearest figure. The energy blast struck its center mass, making it stagger, but it didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It just continued its slow, inexorable advance, humming its terrible, silent song. They scrambled back the way they came, the seam striders now forgotten in the face of this new, more insidious horror. The rasping breaths of the vocal cord and the ethereal humming of the silent choir pursued them through the oppressive darkness of the ducts. They didn't stop until they were back at the service hatch, sealing it hastily behind them. Both were breathing heavily, covered in dust and the clinging, fibrous webbing. "Valerius," Kalen said, his voice strained. "He won't believe this. He can't believe this. It would mean everything he's built his authority on is a lie." "We have the scans," Myra said, though her hand trembled as she clutched the data pad. "The symbol, the entity, he has to listen." But a part of her knew Kalen was right. The truth was too monstrous, too destabilizing. Desperate for answers, for context that Valerius would undoubtedly deny them, Myra thought of Archivist Giant. The old man, with his cryptic warnings and his obsessive study of all-clear records, might be their only hope of understanding what they were truly facing. She found Giant in his usual cramped alcove in the data archives, surrounded by flickering screens and stacks of ancient memory crystals. He looked up as she approached, his eyes, magnified by thick lenses, sharp and knowing. "Technician Myra," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across plasteel. "You have the look of someone who has seen a ghost." "More than a ghost, archivist," Myra said, her voice low and urgent. She quickly recounted what she and Kaelin had witnessed in the vents, the seam striders, the cymbal, the vocal cord, the silent choir. Jayan listened without interruption, his fingers steepled. When she finished, he nodded slowly. The Contagion, as it was crudely labeled, was not merely a disease technician. It was transformative. It sought to integrate, to communicate in its own fashion. "Communicate," Myra echoed, horrified. "That thing in the vents, those singers." "The vocal cord," Jayan mused, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. A poignant designation. Perhaps it still tries to speak of what happened, of the initial breach, of the researchers who changed. He gestured to a dusty, unpowered console. "The original QZ logs are fragmented, heavily redacted, but some data persists if one knows where to look." He began to work, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble on the ancient interface. Screens flickered to life, displaying corrupted files, static-laced audio logs, and heavily censored video snippets. "Dr. Aris Thorne," Jayan murmured, pointing to a blurred personnel file. "Lead researcher, Biolab Omega." He theorized the Contagion had a form of collective intelligence. He argued against simple extermination. He believed it could be understood, perhaps even reasoned with. The file ended abruptly. Status assimilated. "The vocal cord," Myra whispered, realization dawning. "It's him, or what's left of him." "Perhaps," Jayan said. "Or perhaps it is the Contagion's attempt to create a voice, using the raw materials it found. The silent choir, too. They were likely QZ security personnel, the first responders. The Contagion repurposed them, silenced their individual voices but incorporated them into its chorus." He brought up another file, this one detailing the puppeteer spores. "Microscopic, airborne, they target the nervous system, creating a pliable consciousness. Early reports from the QZ spoke of personnel acting erratically, working against containment efforts as if guided by an unseen hand." Myra thought of Purvis, the sanitation worker, his vacant stare, his senseless scrubbing. "They're already out here, Jayan, the spores. I've seen someone affected." Jayan's face, already grim, tightened. "Then the breaches are more significant than even you suspected. The QZ is not just leaking monsters, technician. It is leaking its very consciousness, its will to integrate." He looked directly at Myra, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "Valerius will try to bury this. He will call you a fearmonger, a destabilizer, but you must make them understand. The true horror is not just what is in the QZ, it's what the QZ wants." Leaving Jayan's archive, Myra felt a cold certainty. They were on the precipice of a catastrophe, and those in power were determined to look away. The secrets of the QZ were not just historical records. They were active, insidious threats, and they were already among them. The hum of decay was becoming a roar. Chapter 4: First Incursion. The official response from Overseer Valerius. When Kaelin presented Myra's datapad scans and a carefully edited, dispassionate version of their findings, was predictably dismissive. Vibrations from seismic activity, Captain, Valerius had said, his voice smooth and condescending, echoing slightly in the stark austerity of his command center. He hadn't even bothered to look closely at the images. And as for these organisms, technician Myra is known for her active imagination, probably mutated vermin from the lower levels, nothing more. The QZ seals are triple redundant. They are holding. This matter is closed. He'd waved a hand, a gesture of finality. Kalen had returned from the meeting tight-lipped, his jaw working. He threatened to reassign Myra to refuse reclamation if she persists in spreading alarmist rumors, and he suggested I focus on internal discipline rather than chasing shadows. The message was clear: silence or face the consequences. But the QZ wasn't waiting for official sanction. 2 cycles after Myra and Kaelin's illicit expedition, the first overt incursion occurred. It began in Habitation Block Delta, one of the more densely populated mid-level sectors. A series of power outages, initially dismissed as routine system strain. Then, the screams. Myra was in her unit trying to rig a makeshift air sampler to test for the puppeteer spores when Kaelin's voice crackled urgently over her personal comm, bypassing official channels. Myra, Delta Block, Sector 4. Multiple casualties reported. Unidentified hostiles. Get to the Sector 4 access junction. I'm heading there now. Bring medical supplies if you have any and that pipe of yours. Myra grabbed her emergency medkit and the heavy pipe, her stomach churning. Unidentified hostiles. It could only mean one thing. The corridors leading to Delta Block were chaotic. People ran blindly, their faces masks of terror. Alarms blared, adding to the cacophony. The air tasted wrong, carrying the same faint, sweet acrid scent she'd noticed in the vents, but stronger here, mixed with the coppery tang of blood. She found Kaelin at the designated junction, his pulse pistol drawn, his face grim. A handful of panicked, poorly armed security personnel cowered behind him, their eyes wide. The plasteel blast door leading into Sector 4 was buckled outwards, smoke and the smell of ozone billowing from the gap. What happened? Myra shouted over the din. Don't know for sure, Kaelin yelled back. Power went out, then screaming. Something came through the walls or the floor vents, fast. Reports are confused. Some say insectoid, some say pale figures. The silent choir, seemed striders or both. A security guard, his face streaked with grime and terror, stumbled back from a viewport in the buckled door. They're taking people, dragging them into the maintenance tunnels. We have to go in, Kaelin said, his gaze fixed on the damaged door. There might be survivors. He looked at his trembling guards. Stay here, secure this junction, let no one through. If anything tries to come out, you use lethal force. Understood? They nodded numbly. Kaelin turned to Myra. Ready. She nodded, gripping the pipe. There was no readiness for this, only a cold knot of dread. They squeezed through the gap in the blast door. Sector 4 was a nightmare. Emergency lights cast long, flickering shadows. Bodies lay strewn in the corridor, some still, some twitching faintly. The acrid smell was overpowering, and over it all, a faint, almost inaudible humming. They're not all dead, Myra whispered, kneeling beside a young woman whose eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, a thin trickle of blood from her ear. Her breathing was shallow. Myra checked for a pulse. Faint, thready. But as she touched the woman's neck, she saw it, a tiny, almost invisible puncture mark, surrounded by a patch of pale, web-like fibers. Puppeteer spores delivered by something more direct than airborne diffusion. "Captain!" a choked cry from further down the corridor. They moved cautiously, stepping over debris and bodies. They found another guard, pinned to the wall by several thick, chitinous spikes. He was alive barely, his eyes pleading. As Kalen tried to work the spikes free, Myra saw movement in the shadows of a side passage. Pale figures, the silent choir. They moved with a terrifying grace, their sealed mouths giving no hint of their intent, only that relentless, bone-chilling hum. They weren't attacking. They were observing or waiting. Then, from a gaping hole in the floor plating, a seam strider erupted. It was huge, far larger than the ones they'd seen in the vents, its carapace glistening wetly. It moved with blinding speed towards a cowering civilian Myra hadn't noticed, a maintenance worker trapped in an alcove. "No!" Myra yelled, rushing forward, swinging the pipe. She connected with one of its many legs, a sickening crack echoing in the corridor. The strider hissed, a sound like escaping steam, and recoiled, its multifaceted eyes fixing on her. Kalen fired his pulse pistol. The bolt struck the strider's Arabic meme, Arabic rot, Arabic calf, Arabic zain, Arabic Farsi yay body, and it shrieked, a high-pitched sound that drilled into their skulls. It staggered, then lunged again. The fight was a blur of motion and terror. Myra swung the pipe wildly, deflecting needle-sharp limbs. Kalen laid down covering fire, his shots precise, but the strider was unnaturally resilient. Behind it, more striders were emerging from the hole in the floor, smaller but no less deadly. And all the while, the silent choir watched, their humming a maddening counterpoint to the chaos. One of the smaller striders lunged at Myra, its forelimbs aiming for her face. She stumbled back, falling over a piece of debris. The strider was on her in an instant, its weight pressing her down, its stinking breath hot on her skin. She saw its mandibles open, rows of needle-like teeth. A pulse blast hit it squarely, and it exploded in a shower of ichor and chitin. Kalen stood over her, pistol smoking, his face taut. "We can't hold this." He was right. They were outnumbered, outmatched. The silent choir had begun to advance, their humming growing in intensity, seeming to vibrate the very air. Myra felt a wave of nausea, her vision blurring at the edges. "The vents!" Kalen shouted, pulling her up. "We try to circle back to the junction." They retreated, fighting their way through a fresh wave of striders. The creatures were relentless, driven by a primal hunger. Myra saw one of the choir figures reach out a slender hand towards a fallen guard, its touch gentle, almost caressing, before the guard's eyes glazed over and he began to rise, his movements stiff and unnatural. Another puppet for the spores. They reached a narrow maintenance access tunnel, Kalen blasting the lock. As they scrambled inside, Myra looked back. The silent choir had stopped at the entrance to the tunnel, their forms silhouetted against the flickering emergency lights. They made no attempt to follow. They just watched and hummed. The tunnel led them, after a terrifying, claustrophobic crawl, to an auxiliary shaft that bypassed the main chaos. They emerged into a quieter corridor, the alarms more distant here. Kaelin slumped against the wall, breathing raggedly. Myra checked her own injuries, scrapes, bruises, a searing pain in her shoulder where a strider's limb had grazed her. Valerius, Kaelin panted, his voice hoarse. He has to act now. This isn't rumors, this is an invasion. But when they finally reached the command center, they found Valerius not in a state of emergency, but in a controlled fury. He wasn't directing a defense. He was directing a cover-up. Sector 4 is under quarantine due to a localized power surge and secondary toxic gas leak from the old conduits. Valerius announced to a small group of his most loyal department heads, his voice resonating with false calm. Captain Kaelin and Technician Myra heroically contained the situation, but were exposed to mild neurotoxins, hence their agitated state. They will be confined to medical for observation. Neurotoxins, Kaelin choked out, incredulous. Overseer, there are creatures down there, people are dead, take in. Valerius's eyes were chips of ice. Your report will reflect a gas leak, Captain, or I will find a captain whose report does. He turned to two burly internal security officers who had flanked him. Escort them to medical. Ensure they receive calming treatment. Myra felt a cold despair. They were being silenced, discredited. The truth of the QZ's horrors would be buried along with the dead in Sector 4. The incursion was not just a breach of plasteel and concrete. It was a breach of the fragile illusion of safety that held the bunker together. And those in power were more afraid of the truth than of the monsters. As the guards led them away, Myra knew their fight had just become far more dangerous. They weren't just fighting the contagion, they were fighting their own leadership. Chapter 5: The Song of Woe. The medical observation was a thinly veiled prison. Myra and Kaelin were confined to separate, sterile rooms in the bunker's underfunded infirmary, their comms confiscated, their movements restricted. Dr. Albin, a man whose weariness seemed etched into his bones, administered mild sedatives under direct orders from Valerius. He asked no questions, his eyes carefully avoiding theirs. He knew the official story was a lie, but like so many others, he was trapped by the hierarchy. They're trying to discredit us, Kaelin growled through the haze of the sedative on their first night, his voice a low rumble from the adjoining room, audible through the thin wall. Make us seem delusional. It's worse than that, Myra replied, her own thoughts struggling against the drug-induced fog. They're leaving Sector 4 to fester. Those things. They're still down there, and the spores, they'll spread. She thought of the guard touched by the silent choir, rising with vacant eyes. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of bland nutrient paste, forced medication, and the hollow pronouncements of Valerius's administration broadcast over the bunker's comm system, praising the containment of the Delta Sector incident. No mention of monsters, no mention of the dead beyond a vague reference to unfortunate casualties of the system malfunction. Myra fought the sedatives, forcing herself to stay lucid to analyze. The puppeteer spores were the most insidious threat. They didn't kill, they converted. How many people in the bunker were already hosts? There will suborned their actions guided by the QZ's alien consciousness. Purvis, the sanitation worker, the guard in Sector 4. Who else? She thought of little Una. The child had been quiet lately, her usual appearances in the corridors ceasing. Myra felt a pang of guilt. She'd been too preoccupied with the QZ's physical threats to consider the more subtle dangers to the bunker's most vulnerable. On the fourth cycle of their confinement, the hum started. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a low thrumming vibration in the floor, easily mistaken for the bunker's aging machinery. But Myra, her senses sharpened by adrenaline and a growing paranoia, recognized it. It was the same hum she'd felt outside the QZ's Gamma-9 access, the same resonance that emanated from the vocal cord. But now it was stronger, more pervasive, as if the entity in the vents was drawing closer or growing in power. The hum intensified throughout the cycle, accompanied by the faint, sweet acrid scent of the contagion. It seeped through the ventilation grates, a miasma of dread. Other patients in the infirmary grew restless, moaning in their sleep, their anxieties amplified by the unseen pressure. Then the song began. It wasn't a song in any conventional sense. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and burrowed directly into the mind, a chorus of pure, unadulterated sorrow. A deep, guttural rasping formed a bass note, the vocal cord, and woven through it were high-pitched, keening wails, wordless lamentations filled with an ancient grief. It was the collective sorrow of everyone lost to the contagion, every researcher assimilated, every guard repurposed. It was the sound of Level 12's death knell, amplified and broadcast by the very thing that had caused it. Myra pressed her hands to her ears, but it made no difference. The song was inside her head, resonating in her bones, tearing at her sanity. She could feel Kaelin thrashing in the next room, a muffled roar of anger and pain. Dr. Albin, his face ashen, rushed into her room. "What is that sound?" he stammered, his composure finally cracking. "It's the QZ," Myra gasped, struggling to speak through the mental assault. "It's communicating." The song intensified, and with it came images, unbidden, flashing through Myra's mind. Fragmented memories not her own, gleaming laboratories, faces contorted in terror, flesh twisting, reshaping, a vast collective consciousness absorbing everything, everyone. The birth of the vocal cord, a symphony of tearing tissue and repurposed lungs, trying to scream a warning that became a song of despair. The silent choir, their voices stolen, their sorrow given a new, horrifying outlet. She saw Una, not in a memory but as a present image, superimposed over the sterile walls of her room. The little girl was standing in a darkened corridor, her eyes wide, fixed on a ventilation grate from which a faint, shimmering mist, the puppeteer spores, was visibly leaking. She wasn't afraid. She was listening, her head cocked, a strange serenity on her face. And then she reached a small hand towards the mist. "Una!" Myra screamed, lunging from her cot, the psychic images momentarily overwhelming reality. Albin grabbed her arm. "Technician, calm yourself." "The child, Una, she's in danger, the spores." The song reached a crescendo, a wave of pure psychic anguish that dropped Myra to her knees, clutching her head. Then, as suddenly as it began, it receded, leaving behind a ringing silence and the lingering taste of ozone and sorrow. Kalen was shouting, hammering on the wall. "Myra, are you all right? What was that abomination?" Myra staggered to her feet, trembling. "It was a message," she said, her voice hoarse. "A warning or a claim." She looked at Albin, whose face was a mask of shock. "Valerius can't ignore this. The entire bunker must have heard it." But when Albin activated his comm to report to command, the response was chillingly detached. "We are experiencing audio distortions due to ongoing power fluctuations in Delta Sector," came the smooth, official voice of Valerius's aide. "Engineering is addressing the issue. Maintain calm. All personnel are to disregard any unusual auditory phenomena." Disregard. They were being told to ignore the collective scream of 100 tormented souls. "He's going to let this happen," Kalen said from the next room, his voice raw with disbelief. "He's going to let the bunker fall rather than admit he was wrong." Myra knew he was right, they were on their own. And Una was out there, vulnerable to the Contagion's insidious reach. That night, as the sedatives wore off and the bunker hummed with a new, unspoken terror, Myra made a decision. Valerius and his crumbling hierarchy could rot. She had to get to Una. She had to find a way to fight back, not just against the monsters from the QZ, but against the denial that was choking the life out of the bunker. Working with a desperate, silent urgency, she examined her room. The window was reinforced, the door locked from the outside, but the ventilation grate, it was old, flimsy. Using the metal buckle from her belt, she began to painstakingly work at the screws, the faint, sweet scent of the Contagion a constant, unnerving reminder of what lay beyond. The song of woe had ended, but its echoes resonated, a promise of horrors yet to unfold. And somewhere in those echoing corridors, Una was walking into the embrace of the spores. Chapter 6: The Spreading Stain. The screws on the ventilation grate were rusted, stubborn. Myra worked with a frantic patience, the cheap metal of her belt buckle bending and threatening to snap. Each scrape of metal on metal sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the infirmary's night cycle. Kalen, in the next room, offered muffled encouragement and kept a nervous watch, listening for the tread of guards. Finally, the last screw gave way. Myra prized the grate open, revealing a dark, narrow passage, part of the same network she and Kalen had explored, the network now undeniably compromised. The sweet acrid scent of the Contagion was stronger here, a tangible presence in the stale air. "I'm going for Una," she whispered towards Kalen's wall. "Then, I don't know, we need to warn people, find others who aren't affected." "Be careful, Myra," Kalen's voice came back, tight with concern. "The spores. If Albin's records are right, they don't just control. They change you, slowly, make you want to belong to whatever that thing is." Myra shuddered. The image of Una reaching for the shimmering mist was burned into her mind. She squeezed through the narrow opening, her borrowed pipe clutched tight, its cold weight a small comfort. The duct was filthy, choked with the familiar fibrous webbing. She moved by touch as much as sight, the darkness absolute. Emerging into a larger service conduit, she paused, listening. The bunker was unnervingly quiet, not the usual hum of machinery and distant activity, but a watchful, waiting stillness. The song of woe might have faded, but its effects lingered. Fear was a palpable entity in the recycled air. She made her way towards Habitation Unit 47B, Una's registered dwelling. The corridors were deserted. Emergency lights flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. Several times Myra ducked into alcoves, her heart pounding as solitary figures shuffled past, their movements stiff, their faces blank, their eyes carrying that same glassy sheen she'd seen in Purvis the sanitation worker. The stain was spreading. More and more were succumbing to the puppeteer spores. She found Una's hab unit. The door was ajar. Myra pushed it open slowly, pipe raised. The small room was empty, Una's meager belongings undisturbed. Her mother was not there either. A half-eaten ration bar lay on the small table as if someone had left in a hurry. Panic tightened Myra's chest. Where would Una go? The image from the psychic assault replayed. Una, the vent, the shimmering mist. Which vent? Which corridor? She remembered Una's words. The shadows dance here. They have too many elbows. The child had always been drawn to the periphery of the QZ, to the places where the bunker's decay was most evident. Corridor 7C near the Gamma-9 access. Myra raced through the deserted corridors, her boots slapping against the plasteel floor. The silence was more terrifying than the alarms of the Delta Sector incursion. It was the silence of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. As she neared 7C, she saw him, Archivist Giant. He was standing near the Gamma-9 QZ door, not looking at it, but at a small ventilation grate near the floor, the one Una often peered into. He held a small, flickering candle, its light casting his aged face in sharp relief. "Giant," Myra called softly. He turned, his eyes wide, not with fear but with a kind of awe. "Technician, she is remarkable." "Una, is she here?" Myra approached cautiously. "She was," Giant whispered, gesturing to the vent. "She spoke to them, or they spoke to her, the breathers from within." He meant the QZ. "She said they were lonely, that they wanted to share their dreams." Myra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the corridor's temperature. "Giant, the spores, they're dangerous. They control." "Control," Giant mused, his gaze distant. "Or unite." She was not afraid, she seemed. "Chosen." He looked at Myra, a strange lucidity in his eyes. "The old hierarchy is dead, technician. Valerius clings to ashes. A new consciousness is emerging, born of the QZ. Una is to be a bridge, perhaps. A first acolyte, pure and untainted by the old world's despair." Myra stared at him, horrified. Giant, the scholar, the keeper of history. Had he succumbed? Or was he simply interpreting the inevitable with a chilling detachment? "Giant, where is she?" Myra demanded, her voice rising. Before he could answer, a sound echoed from down the corridor. A rhythmic shuffling, accompanied by a low, resonant hum. Not the sorrowful song of the vocal cord, but something more purposeful, more anticipatory. The silent choir, at least a dozen of them. They rounded the distant bend, moving with their unnerving, fluid grace. And at their head, walking with a newfound, eerie confidence, was Overseer Valerius. His usually immaculate uniform was slightly disheveled. His eyes, fixed on Myra, held that same glassy, unfocused sheen she'd seen in the others. A faint, beatific smile played on his lips. The puppeteer spores had claimed the bunker's leader. "Technician Myra," Valerius said, his voice unnervingly calm, devoid of its usual arrogance. "And Archivist Giant, how opportune. You are invited to witness the new dawn." Behind him, the silent choir hummed, their collective sound a palpable pressure. Myra saw other figures among them, faces she recognized, guards, technicians, medics, all moving with that same synchronized, puppet-like grace, all part of the spreading stain. "What have you done, Valerius?" Myra breathed, stepping back, pulling Giant with her. "I have embraced the future," Valerius replied, his smile widening. "The contagion. It offers unity, an end to strife, a collective purpose. Level 12 is not a tomb, Myra. It is a womb, and it is ready to give birth to a new era for this bunker." Giant was trembling beside her. "He's lost," the archivist whispered, his brief moment of strange lucidity gone, replaced by dawning terror. "They all are." "Una showed us the way," Valerius continued, taking a step closer. The silent choir mirrored his movement. She understood. She accepted the gift. She is with the vocal cord now, learning the true songs. She will be the voice of the new age. Myra's blood ran cold. Una with that monstrous entity of flesh and sorrow. "You're insane," she said, raising her pipe. "This isn't unity, it's assimilation." Valerius chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Semantics, technician, soon we will all be one. The seals on Gamma 9 are failing. The true breach is imminent. Why fight it? Join us. Be part of the chorus." The silent choir advanced, their humming building, pressing against Myra's skull. She saw movement in the smaller vents, seam striders, emerging like cockroaches, their chittering a counterpoint to the choir's song. Kalen, where was Kalen? She had to hope he'd found a way out of the infirmary, that he was rallying whatever sane pockets of resistance remained. Because standing here, facing her spore-controlled leader and his silent, humming entourage, Myra knew she and Giant were hopelessly outmatched. The QZ wasn't just leaking, it was overflowing, and its tide was washing away everything. The bunker was no longer their sanctuary. It was rapidly becoming a part of the quarantine zone itself. Chapter 7: Descent into the Zone. "We have to fall back, Giant," Myra yelled, shoving the trembling archivist behind her. The corridor offered no escape route forward. Valerius and his silent choir blocked the path, seam striders skittering from the vents, effectively cutting off retreat. The Gamma 9 QZ access door loomed at their backs, its surface visibly vibrating now, the hum from within a palpable force. Cracks like dark veins spiderwebbed across its plasteel surface. The seals were not just failing, they were actively breaking apart. "No escape, technician," Valerius said, his voice resonating with the choir's hum. "The transformation is upon us. Accept it, become more." Myra swung her pipe at the nearest strider, connecting with a sickening crunch. It shrieked, but another took its place. Giant, surprisingly agile for his age, jabbed his flickering candle into the multifaceted eyes of another strider, making it recoil with a hiss. A sudden explosion rocked the corridor from the direction Valerius had come. Not an attack, but a concussive blast, followed by shouting, Kalen's voice, sharp and commanding. Myra, giant, this way. Through the dust and smoke, Myra saw him, Kalen, flanked by a handful of armed security personnel, their faces grim and determined. Dr. Albin was with them, improbably wielding a heavy medical scanner like a club. They were laying down, covering fire, pulse bolts searing the air, forcing some of the choir and striders back. Kalen, Myra cried, relief flooding through her. The main access to Gamma 9 is about to go, Kalen shouted, gesturing frantically. That door won't hold for minutes. We found another way. An old emergency conduit leads into the upper levels of the QZ. It's our only chance. Into the QZ. The thought was horrifying, but staying here meant certain assimilation. Valerius, momentarily distracted by Kalen's assault, shrieked, an inhuman sound that was quickly swallowed by the choir's intensified hum. He pointed a finger at Kalen's group. Heretics, obstructions, the choir will silence you. The silent choir surged forward, no longer hesitant, their movements terrifyingly coordinated. More striders poured from the vents. Now Myra, Kalen bellowed. Myra grabbed Giant's arm. Come on. They scrambled towards Kalen's group under the cover of their fire. Pulse bolts sizzled past Myra's head. A strider lunged, and Kalen blasted it at point-blank range. The stench of burned chitin filled the air. This way, Kalen led them to an almost invisible panel in the wall, one Myra had never noticed, hidden behind a false conduit casing. He wrenched it open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft descending into blackness. Emergency egress tunnel for Biolab Omega personnel. Hasn't been used in 50 years. If the Contagion hasn't sealed it from the other side, it might give us a path around this madness. Around it or deeper into it. Myra hesitated, the unknown horrors of the QZ warring with the certain doom behind them. The main QZ door groaned, a large crack appearing down its center, a sickly yellow light pulsing from within. No choice, Myra, Kalen urged, already halfway into the shaft. Myra helped a terrified giant into the opening, then followed, Kalen's remaining guards and Dr. Albin bringing up the rear, firing back at the advancing choir. The last thing Myra saw before Kalen slammed the panel shut was Valerius's face, contorted in a silent snarl, his eyes glowing faintly with the QZ's light, and the massive Gamma 9 door beginning to buckle inwards. The shaft was steep, almost a vertical drop, with rusted rungs set into the slimy walls. Their lights cut feeble circles in the oppressive darkness. The air was thick, cloying, saturated with the Contagion's sweet acrid signature and the damp, earthy smell of profound decay. Distant sounds echoed up from below, wet slitherings, faint chitterings, and a constant, deep thrumming that vibrated through the rungs into their hands and feet. The deep murmur, Giant had called it, from the lowest levels of the QZ. How far down does this go? Myra asked, her voice tight. Schematics show it connecting to a sub-level of what used to be QZ Observation Deck Alpha, Kalen replied, his voice strained from the climb down. Supposedly shielded. From there, we improvise. The descent felt endless. One of Kalen's guards, a young man named Rorik, began to cough, a wet, racking sound that echoed ominously. When he brought his hand away from his mouth, it was slicked with something dark, shimmering faintly with the QZ's unnatural luminescence. "Spores," Albin said grimly, examining Rorik's hand by the light of his scanner. "More concentrated here. The air is saturated." He produced a few flimsy filter masks from his medkit. "Won't stop them entirely, but it might slow it down." As they donned the masks, a new sound reached them from below. A wet, rhythmic rasping punctuated by soft clicks. The vocal cord. But it sounded different here, deeper within its domain. More powerful. And interwoven with it, a child's voice, thin and clear, humming a simple, repetitive tune. "Luna." "She's down there," Myra whispered, a cold dread gripping her. "With that thing." They reached the bottom of the shaft, emerging into a cramped, plasteel-lined corridor. It was eerily silent here, the distant thrumming less pronounced. Sections of the wall were coated in the pulsating fungal pods Giant had called the breathers, their bioluminescence casting the passage in a sickly, shifting glow. They seemed to recoil slightly as the group passed. "Observation Deck Alpha should be through here," Kalen said, consulting a flickering schematic on his datapad. He pointed to a heavy, sealed door at the end of the corridor. "If the lock still responds." It did surprisingly, hissing open with a release of stale, pressurized air. They stepped into a large, circular room. Thick, reinforced viewport windows lined one curved wall, but they were dark, opaque, coated on the outside with decades of grime or contagion growth. This was once where researchers, clad in protective suits, observed the initial experiments in Level 12. Now it was just another forgotten tomb. Except for the figure huddled in the center of the room. Archivist Giant, who had been quiet during the descent, suddenly gasped. The first host, the legends, they spoke of Patient Zero, not dead but transformed. It wasn't Una, it wasn't the vocal cord, it was something far, far worse. A colossal, vaguely humanoid figure sat slumped on a crude throne of fused metal and bone, seemingly integrated into the room's machinery. Its flesh was a horrifying tapestry of mutated tissue, glowing faintly with an internal light, intertwined with cables and conduits that snaked into the walls and floor. Its head was a misshapen mass, but two large, intelligent eyes, burning with a cold, ancient malice, fixed on them. It was the first host, the origin point of the contagion, and it was hideously, terrifyingly alive. And it was aware of them. The air crackled with an unseen energy. Rorik, the infected guard, suddenly screamed, his body convulsing. He clawed at his own face, his eyes rolling back, as the shimmering luminescence spread rapidly across his skin. He lunged, not at the first host, but at Dr. Albin, his hands transforming into chitinous claws. Kalen reacted instantly, firing his pulse pistol. Rorik's head exploded, but the psychic pressure in the room intensified. The first host hadn't moved, yet its will was a tangible force. From the shadows behind its throne, figures emerged. More of the silent choir, their sealed mouths humming a new, discordant melody. And with them, smaller, scuttling shapes made of bone and sinew, the bone scuttlers. "It knows we're here," Kalen gritted out, shoving Myra behind him. It was waiting. The descent into the QZ hadn't been an escape. It had been an invitation. They had walked directly into the heart of the Contagion's power, into the lair of its progenitor. And Una was somewhere deeper still, her innocent hum a prelude to a far more terrible symphony. Chapter 8. The Heart of the Horror. The observation deck became a charnel house. The first host remained on its throne of bone and fused metal, its ancient, malevolent eyes watching the carnage with cold amusement. The psychic pressure it exuded was immense, disorienting, filling Myra's mind with whispers of surrender, of the ecstasy of assimilation. She fought it, focusing on the tangible horrors before her. Kalen and his remaining two guards laid down a desperate barrage of pulse fire. The bone scuttlers, surprisingly agile, swarmed towards them, their clattering a counterpoint to the silent choir's oppressive hum. Dr. Albin, abandoning his useless scanner, swung a detached metal strut with surprising ferocity, crushing scuttlers against the floor. Giant, pale and terrified, huddled behind a console, muttering prayers or incantations from forgotten texts. "They're too many," one of Kalen's guards screamed, as a scuttler leaped onto his chest, its bony claws tearing at his throat. He went down, gurgling. The silent choir advanced, their touch not immediately violent but insidious. One of them reached for the remaining guard, its smooth, featureless face inches from his. The guard froze, his eyes glazing over, his weapon clattering to the floor. He turned, a new, blank smile on his lips, and joined the choir's ranks, converted in seconds. "Fall back," Kalen yelled, grabbing Myra's arm and pulling her towards a service panel he'd spotted on the far side of the room. "There has to be another way out of this hell." Albin covered their retreat, his makeshift club a blur, until a member of the choir simply stepped into his swing, absorbing the blow without flinching, and enveloped him in a chilling embrace. Albin's struggles ceased. His eyes took on the familiar glassy sheen. Now it was just Myra, Kalen, and a rapidly shrinking giant against the full might of the QZ's inner sanctum. The first host's psychic laughter echoed in Myra's skull, a soundless wave of triumph. Kalen blasted the service panel's lock. It hissed open, revealing another dark, narrow passage. In. As they scrambled through, Myra glanced back. The first host slowly raised a hand, a gesture of dismissal. The silent choir did not pursue. They merely watched, their humming a promise of inevitable return. The new passage was smaller, tighter than the last, reeking of decay and something else, a cloying sweetness like overripe fruit, and the child's humming was louder here, closer. "Una. This tunnel, it leads towards Biolab Omega," Kalen panted, consulting his damaged datapad. "Where the vocal cord is, where Giant said Thorn worked." The passage opened into a vast, cavernous space. This was it, Biolab Omega. Ruined equipment lay scattered like forgotten toys. Strange, bioluminescent fungi coated the walls, pulsing with soft light. And in the center, suspended by thick, vein-like tendrils from the ravaged ceiling, was the vocal cord. It was larger here in its heartland than the portion Myra had seen in the vents. A mountain of pulsating flesh, its raw, exposed vocal structures vibrating with that deep, sorrowful rasp. But the sound was more complex now, interwoven with whimpers, fragments of speech, and Una's clear, innocent humming, which seemed to originate from somewhere within the grotesque mass. And there, at the base of the vocal cord, nestled amongst its fleshy folds as if in a protective embrace, was Una. She was pale, her eyes closed, but she was smiling, her small hands resting on the pulsating surface of the entity. She wore a crude garland of the bioluminescent fungi in her hair. She wasn't a prisoner. She was an attendant, a priestess. Una, Myra cried, stepping forward. The child's eyes snapped open. They were no longer the clear, curious eyes Myra remembered. They glowed with the same faint, internal luminescence as the first host, as valerious as all the converted. "Myra," she said, her voice echoing slightly, layered with other, deeper tones. "You came to join the song." The vocal cords rasping intensified and the fragments of speech became clearer. "Mistake, all clear, a lie, we waited, we grew, we sing the new world." It was Thorne's voice, or a grotesque parody of it, filtered through the contagion. "Una, this isn't you," Myra pleaded. "It's controlling you." "It shares," Una said, her smile serene. "It shows me everything, the beautiful growth, the connections. We are all one voice now, Myra. Soon, everyone in the bunker will sing with us." Kalen raised his pistol. "Myra, step aside. That thing has her. We have to destroy it." "No," Myra shouted. "There has to be a way to save her." But as Kalen took aim, Una raised a hand. From the fleshy folds of the vocal cord, a shimmering cloud of spores erupted, far denser, far more potent than anything Myra had witnessed before. It billowed towards them. "Masks!" Kalen yelled, but it was too late for Giant. The old archivist, mesmerized by the sight of the vocal cord and Una, inhaled deeply. He shuddered, a beatific smile spreading across his face, and then crumpled to the floor, his body already beginning to subtly shift, his skin taking on the pale luminescence. Myra and Kalen stumbled back, firing blindly into the spore cloud. The vocal cord shrieked, a sound of myriad voices blended in pain and fury. Una cried out, a sound of genuine distress. "It feels," Myra realized. "Una is connected to it. If we hurt it, we hurt her." The psychic assault from the vocal cord was immense now, not sorrowful but filled with rage. Images of tearing flesh, of burning agony, flooded Myra's mind. Kalen roared, clutching his head, his pistol wavering. Myra saw her chance. The core of the vocal cord, the central nexus from which the tendrils spread and Una's voice seemed to emanate, it pulsed with a brighter, more concentrated light. If she could disrupt that, sever Una's connection without destroying the child. "Kalen, cover me," she yelled, grabbing a sharp, jagged piece of metal debris. "I'm going for the nexus." She charged forward into the receding spore cloud, towards the monstrous, singing heart of the contagion. The vocal cord thrashed, its tendrils whipping like angry snakes. Una screamed her name, her voice a mixture of the contagion's fury and a child's fear. Myra dodged a lashing tendril, the sweet acrid stench gagging her. She leaped onto the lower folds of the entity's flesh, its surface slick and yielding. The psychic noise was deafening, a cacophony of stolen voices. She saw the nexus, a hand's breadth away, a pulsing orb of concentrated contagion energy, with Una's small form directly above it, seemingly drawing power from it. She raised the metal shard, aiming for the delicate tendrils that connected Una to the Nexus, not the Nexus itself. A desperate gamble. As she struck, a wave of pure agony, not her own, ripped through her. The vocal cord convulsed violently. Una shrieked, a piercing, human sound, and her eyes flickered, the alien luminescence dimming for a fraction of a second. The entire cavern shook. Cracks snaked across the ceiling. The deep murmur from below intensified into a grinding roar. The first host, even from its distant chamber, seemed to unleash a wave of pure psychic rage that buckled Myra's knees. The vocal cord began to collapse in on itself, its song dissolving into a mess of discordant shrieks and groans. Una slumped, unconscious, her connection to the Nexus severed, rolling free from the dying mass. Myra scrambled to the child, scooping her into her arms. Una was pale, unresponsive, but the alien glow in her eyes was gone. Kalen was beside them, hauling Myra up. "The whole level is coming down. We have to go, now." Biolab Omega was tearing itself apart. Chunks of rock and plasteel rained from the ceiling. The ground buckled. The dying screams of the vocal cord were a fitting soundtrack to the destruction. They plunged back into the narrow service tunnel they'd used to enter, Kalen practically dragging Myra and the unconscious Una. Behind them, the heart of the QZ's horror imploded, taking its song and its priestess's master with it. But Myra knew with a chilling certainty that the first host was still alive, and it would be furious. Chapter 9: Aftermath and Echoes. The escape from the collapsing Biolab Omega was a desperate, terrifying scramble. The narrow service tunnel groaned and shifted around them, dust and debris choking the air. Kalen, driven by a primal instinct for survival, found passage after passage, some barely wide enough to squeeze through, always moving upwards, away from the QZ's dying heart and the incandescent rage of the first host that Myra could still feel pressing at the edges of her mind. Una remained unconscious in Myra's arms, a dead weight, her breathing shallow. They emerged, finally, not into the familiar, decaying corridors of their own bunker levels, but into a section Myra had never seen, a place not on any schematic she had access to. It was an old, emergency sub-level, even more ancient and derelict than the rest of the bunker. The air here was surprisingly clear, cold, and tasted faintly of outside, of soil and rain and something wild. Kalen collapsed against a crumbling concrete wall, chest heaving. I think this is one of the original surface access tunnels, sealed off before the main bunker was even fully completed." He pointed a trembling finger at a massive, rust-eaten circular door, clearly designed to withstand immense pressure. "If we can open that." Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar sensation, flickered in Myra's chest. The surface, could it be, after everything? It took them hours, working with scavenged tools Kalen found in a forgotten storage locker, to even begin to budge the door's ancient locking mechanisms. Una eventually stirred, weak and disoriented, the alien luminescence completely gone from her eyes. She remembered little of her time with the vocal cord, only fragmented dreams of songs and a vast, warm presence. The Contagion's direct hold on her was broken, but Myra knew the spores she'd inhaled would leave their mark. As they worked, they spoke little, the horrors they'd witnessed still too raw. Giant, Albin, Kalen's guards all lost. Valerius and countless others assimilated. The bunker they knew was gone, transformed into an extension of the QZ, a monument to the Contagion's victory. The first host was still down there, patient, eternal, perhaps already beginning to rebuild its network, to find new voices for its choir. Finally, with a groan of tortured metal, the massive surface door creaked open a few inches, revealing not the irradiated wasteland of bunker legend, nor the idyllic paradise of the false all clear, but a gray, overcast sky and the skeletal silhouettes of dead trees against it. The air that gusted in was cold, damp, and carried the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. "It's real," Kalen breathed, staring at the sliver of alien world. They forced the door open further, enough to slip through. They found themselves on a desolate, windswept hillside. The bunker entrance behind them was little more than a weed-choked concrete scar on the landscape. The world was muted, gray, but undeniably open. There was no sign of civilization, only the rustling of wind through dead grass and the distant cry of an unseen bird. The all clear hadn't been a lie about the world's survivability, merely a horrific underestimation of the threat they had cultivated within their own walls. Humanity, or what was left of it, had clearly moved on, or simply died off in these parts. Una, wrapped in a piece of scavenged thermal blanket, looked at the vast, empty sky with wide, fearful eyes. This world was as alien to her as the QZ's horrors. "What now?" Myra asked, the words feeling small and inadequate in the face of the bleak expanse. They had escaped the immediate horror, but they were survivors in a dead world, carrying the trauma of the bunker and the lingering taint of the contagion. Myra knew the spores were still in her system, in Kalen, in Una's. Dormant for now, perhaps, but not gone. The song of the QZ was a part of them, an echo in their blood. Kalen looked towards the horizon where the gray sky met the gray land. "We walk," he said simply. "We look for others, or we make a new place, away from the concrete tombs." There were no easy answers, no triumphant victories. They had crippled a part of the contagion, saved one child from its immediate grasp, but the entity itself, the first host, remained. The bunker was lost. Their community was gone. They were three survivors, haunted by what they'd seen, what they'd done, and what they might yet become if the spores within them ever truly awakened. As they began their journey into the unknown, Myra glanced back at the sealed bunker entrance. She could almost hear it, a faint, residual hum carried on the wind, the eternal, sorrowful song of the vocal cord, the anticipatory thrum of the first host, the silent chorus of the assimilated. The quarantine zone was not just a place anymore. It was a memory, a nightmare, and a warning. A warning that some doors are best left unopened, and some secrets are buried for a reason. The hum of decay was now the whisper of the wind, a constant reminder of the fine line between survival and assimilation, and the enduring, horrifying echo of the songs sung in the deep, dark places beneath the earth. The world outside was a new kind of quarantine, its dangers unknown, its future uncertain. But it was, at least, a world under an open sky. For now. The end.